Welcome to the channel, guys. We are back again, and today I'm going to be talking about Carlisle by Parfums de Marly. So stay tuned for that. If you like the content, hit that like and subscribe button. I really do appreciate it. Now, Carlisle is a fragrance from Parfums de Marly that does get a lot of love. It does get a lot of talk in the community. I haven't actually taken the time to review this one, but I decided it's a good time to do that. Probably the weather's right, and I haven't really gotten around to this one, but I have worn it a good amount of times. So this one often gets talked about with respect to red tobacco, which I am going to be sort of talking about or doing a semi-comparison with that fragrance. And also, it gets talked about with respect to Herod. So I will make some references to Herod as well. But this fragrance is actually also interesting. I think one of the things that I always found interesting is that people do compare this to red tobacco, even though for some reason they don't actually list tobacco as a note. Even on the Parfums de Marly website, if you look at the note breakdown, tobacco isn't there. However, if you do look at their description of Carlisle, they do talk about how the tonka brings out the tobacco. So I find that a little weird, and I guess maybe that has something to do or can show you how notes listings don't always show you the whole picture with what's actually in the fragrance and don't really give you an accurate idea of all of the notes or accords that are present or not present in the fragrance. Now, I will also say, I have often argued with people about this one because at least the first few times I wore this, I would not have said there was much of a resemblance to red tobacco. However, I gotta admit that as I've worn it more and more, I do see that there is certainly some degree of resemblance. The resemblance that I get is really in the sense that there's kind of this pungent tobacco in red tobacco, and I do think that is also present in this fragrance. The dry down is also somewhat similar in the sense that they have that sort of creamy chocolatey vibe. Now we'll get to both of those in detail in a second. I'm going to actually first jump into the opening, what I get within this fragrance, and I think the opening is the most complex part of this fragrance. So it does have actually quite a lot going on, and I do get the patchouli right away, and to me it comes off as more of a bit of a chocolatey patchouli. So I do get hints of that sort of chocolatey undertone that this fragrance has, and I do get that sort of pungent, almost wet tobacco that red tobacco has. Now what else I get from this is the rose. I was actually pretty surprised, especially the last few times I've worn it, to pick up a little bit more of the rose. The rose is not super strong. There's just really a hint of rose, and it is very subdued and a little bit sweet. So I don't find it if you're put off by rose or you're not a big rose fan, I don't think that's something that'll really affect. I think it's well done in this fragrance. It adds a nice bit of character to it, and it doesn't make it particularly feminine or masculine in either way. So I think the rose is really tastefully done, and it does add a nice dimension to that opening. Now what also this does have an apple note. I don't really get a ton of actual apple, so to me it doesn't really smell like apples. I get more of a fruity vibe, and sometimes that plays with the rose a little bit to give it a slightly candied feel, but there is a slight fruitiness with this one that I do get, and again, that all plays a backseat to that sort of pungent aroma that this one has, especially in the opening. So it does also have, I will say, a slight sort of almost boozy quality, although it doesn't come off smelling like rum or anything like that, so it doesn't really smell alcoholic, and there are no boozy notes, but there is something with that punchiness that gives it a slight boozy accord. So altogether, it is somewhat reminiscent of red tobacco. I will admit that, fine. I will say it. I will finally say it. I know I've discussed this with many people, and part of the reason that I felt so off about this is that, they didn't put tobacco as a note, but as I mentioned, they put it in the description, so that's really kind of weird. But anyways, yes, it does have similarities to red tobacco. Now, when it dries down, the pungentness from that sort of tobacco vibe does certainly remain quite strong. So that takes a long time to dissipate. It takes hours to really, like, it slowly tapers off for hours, really. But it is there for a long time. So if you do like that sort of pungent, almost wet tobacco vibe, this definitely has that, and it has it for a very, very long time in the fragrance. Now, as it dries down, it becomes a little bit more creamy and a little bit more chocolatey. So the patchouli definitely becomes, to me, the star over time. And it becomes the star with that chocolatey vibe that it has. A little bit creamy, a little bit smooth. I think there's vanilla in this, I'm not sure. And to me, I think that adds a sort of slight sweetness and a slight creamy dimension to that chocolatey patchouli. So they kind of play together. And they do that very, very well, in my opinion. Now, like I mentioned, that sort of pungent tobacco vibe that it has tones down over time. It slowly shifts off into the background until it is completely gone. Now, how long that actually is a very long time. So I will say, impressive performance. This is pretty strong stuff. So, I mean, the thing is that if you talk about this one with respect to Herod, the thing I'll say about Herod that is nice is that Herod's a little bit more unique. I find it is, yes, it is kind of like a cherry tobacco, but it definitely has a different take on that. It has a different kind of very dry tobacco that doesn't make it smell like, you know, Insurrection 2 Wild or, you know, any of the other, or something like L'Homme Ideal Extreme, where they have that cherry tobacco thing. It does definitely smell quite different, and it does have this very aromatic, dry tobacco, which is quite a bit different from this fragrance. So the two fragrances themselves, I don't know that, at least on smell profile, it's, you know, informative to really compare them, other to say how different they actually are. But this one performs much better. So for me, with respect to Herod, you know, I have grown to like Herod a little bit more than I did originally. But it's not the best performer. It's a little bit of a weak fragrance. And I find, you know, for a tobacco fragrance, I think it should or could perform better. And especially for something people want to wear usually in the fall and winter, that it should perform a little bit better. This, on the other hand, is quite beastly. So, you know, it does have a lot of longevity, and I would put it close to the 12-hour mark for sure, for how long it lasts. Now, it isn't massively projecting the entire time. I get, you know, good projection, not massive, not absolutely room-filling, but solid projection for like 2 to 3 hours, and it starts to taper down. Still has very good sillage for 5-6 hours. And then on top of that, it does last as sitting a little bit close to the skin for the remainder of, you know, close to 12 hours. So that is nice. It is nice that it lasts a long time, especially if you like performance out of a fragrance. This will easily get you through a workday. You probably could wear this to work, speaking of which, on, you know, if you go a little bit lighter, especially in the winter time. It does have a certain warmth to it that I think is inviting. And, you know, so for situations, I think it's best in the fall and winter, and best for a sort of evening out, maybe even a bit of a date fragrance, because it does have a certain warmth even in the opening that is inviting. And I think that it is likable enough that if you don't overspray it, it'll be easy to wear to the office, although this could easily, you know, overwhelm some people. And, you know, I think formal occasions, so, you know, nights out, more formal occasions, probably the best, although I can see wearing this one fairly casually as well, just as with is my taste. But again, that's maybe not the best time to wear it, but again, I think best suited for nights out, formal occasions. Whether or not you need to own this as well as red tobacco, I'm not sure. Red tobacco is significantly cheaper, even on the gray market. You know, I think you can get red tobacco for maybe 80 or 90 US dollars. I want to say you might be able to find it cheaper. And even if you get Carlisle cheaply, I think it's still around $130, maybe a little bit more. I haven't checked so much. So there's a price point difference between those two, but I would say that this one has probably a little bit more depth and a little bit more character than red tobacco. You know, red tobacco I actually really, really enjoy as well. But I find this one, with that sort of fruity vibe that it has with the addition of the rose, and it does enough to set itself apart from from that fragrance, and it does have a little bit more depth, a little bit more character. So, I mean, it's ultimately up to you. I think you should get your nose on both of them. If you like them, decide which one you want, or you can get both. But there is definitely some overlap there between these two fragrances. And personally, I'm the kind of person who's a little bit more, or I try to be a little bit more practical in my collection. Obviously, that hasn't been going so great because my collection is already more than I'll wear in the next 20 years. But, you know, I could see somebody saying you don't need both of these fragrances. So that ultimately is, you know, up to you and what you want to do with your collection and whether or not you even like either of these fragrances. But to me, this is actually one of the better Parfums de Marly fragrances. I am a fan of the house. It's not probably in my top 4 for me personally. Might not even be in my top 5. I'd have to, you know, think of a list for Parfums de Marly. But it is a good one, and I think it's worth getting your nose on. It's a little bit more of an oriental. It is a little bit more unique, a little bit darker than some of the, especially the recent releases that they have. So it is an interesting fragrance, and that's all I'm really going to say about it. It is a nice, long-lasting fragrance from Parfums de Marly, and worth getting your nose on. So I'm going to cut it there. Have you tried Carlisle? Have you tried Red Tobacco? How do you feel about these two fragrances together? Are they as similar as some people would let you or lead you on to believe? Let me know in a comment down below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.